Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, and I would like to thank the dean for his warm remarks, and for the University of Miami for hosting this event. I completely agree with the dean that Miami has been on the cutting edge of a number of issues for years now. I look at what they did with behavioral finance. For a number of years, they've been leading the field in that respect. And then since a couple of years ago, have been really thinking about ways to lead when it comes to sustainability. And it's really great to see. And it's also great to be here presenting with my co-author, Khrystyna. And the dean mentioned that you get 2 keynote speakers for the price of one. Let me be clear. The one that they paid for was Khrystyna. The one that they get for free is me. So for what that's worth, you hope the advice today is good. I'm interested to talk to you today about what's going on in sustainability reporting. And in particular, what I want to talk about is just make sure, like a little level setting, talk about what it is, what we do through the Value Reporting Foundation in developing SASB standards, and then talk about what to expect going forward. So very policy oriented. And then Khrystyna is going to have an opportunity to talk about some research that we've both been working on related to the standards development process and what sort of impact that can actually have on the dialogue that takes place between companies and the capital markets. And so we'll be looking forward to her remarks in the second part. But let me start with an introduction to the SASB standards. So really thinking about why do we even go through the effort of developing SASB standards? It started from a premise that the capital markets need good information about the risks and opportunities that companies face. And what was pretty clear when SASB was founded was that there were opportunities to go beyond just the traditional reporting that we had in financial capital markets. Accounting systems have developed to really do a great job in capturing the existing assets and liabilities that companies have, but they aren't intended to really capture in the financial statements the things that lie just beyond that, the risks and opportunities of tomorrow. And increasingly, as we see shifts in the way that the economies are shaped, where there's fewer brick and mortar types of industries, it's ever more, increasingly more important that companies can think about tomorrow and the future, because there is so much potential for disruption within economies. And so investors have been asking for more information, and SASB was really focused on trying to improve that. Now, traditionally, there have been, not traditionally, but like for a number of years, companies have been increasingly disclosing on the impacts that they're having on the world around them. But that wasn't necessarily meeting the needs of investors. Rather than having, 100-page, sort of warm and fuzzy dialogue of all the things a company might do from a philanthropic perspective, what investors really want is quantitative information that links to the most important issues that are part of the corporate strategy that the companies build. So really, what differentiates SASB is thinking about, I think of it as like these 6 principles in a sense, but think of the first 3 as being the goal that SASB has in developing standards, to focus on information that would be essentially like relevant to the capital markets, financially material types of information that would be decision useful for investors to use and cost effective for companies to report with. And then the path that we use to get there, so this is how we go about thinking about developing standards, as we think about what is an industry doing, what are the activities that they have. We look for evidence on financial impacts. We look for evidence of what investors are interested in, and then we engage with the marketplace, and we talk to companies, we talk to investors, we listen to them, and we get feedback on the standards, and then before we finalize anything. So let me kind of summarize that a bit by talking about our approach to financial materiality. So what we're really thinking about there is like the goal is to help identify those ESG factors that are reasonably likely to have a significant impact on the financial condition, the operating performance, or market valuation of companies within an industry. And so, what we're really saying there is like, this isn't just about how to protect a company from risks that are facing it. It's actually 2 parts to think about: what is a company doing because of its regular business activities that may lead to a longer term impact on its financial condition or operating performance related to environmental or social capitals. And then also, what are things maybe that it's not doing, but that others, like because of a changing environment or a changing context in which it's doing business, might affect it through transition risks related to regulation or shifting customer preferences. And so we think about both of those types of issues, both inside out and outside in, really is one way to think of it. And then look for, well, can we see a link to what would impact the company's financial statements? Are we thinking about an opportunity for revenue growth? Are we thinking about an unrecognized liability, maybe an unimpaired asset down the road? Are we talking about shifting cost structures within a business? So really thinking about that, and then looking for evidence of what it would be useful to investors. What are investors asking about? So that's what we're trying to accomplish. And the way that we then do that is really through a two-part approach, where the first part is to think about the broad dimensions of sustainability. So from that respect, we're trying to think about 5 major categories on what would be sustainability issues. So you can think, and we can maybe go to the next slide, that we're looking for not just one issue like greenhouse gas emissions or pollution. We're thinking about broadly a number of environmental type of issues, waste, water management, ecological impacts. We're also thinking about social capital, the more outward facing aspects of a company's interaction with people. So it could be like, are we, is a company protecting its customer privacy? Is it taking care of data security? What are the impacts of product quality and safety for its customers? And then there's a more inward facing aspect of the people issues. So thinking about like the human capital aspects of a company's business. Every company has employees. We often hear that, but what we ask of companies isn't the same in all industries. And so really there, we're kind of thinking about like, what are employees being asked to do? Are there issues around customers or employee safety? Or maybe it's about like the ability to hire employees in the first place or to retain them. And so those may be critical issues. And then there are 2 other categories that think of it a little more as like the integration of a number of these ESG related issues, E and S issues into G and strategy. And so those are the 5 broad dimensions. But I think what's really important here to think is like, we are not like a one issue type of organization. We're really trying to think very broadly around the universe of possible issues that relate to what the resources are that companies depend on, and what are the impacts that they have on the world around them. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is to think about what are the industries that are out there, because every industry has a unique profile. And so we carve the business world up into 11 sectors and 77 specific industries. And the industry aspect is really important there. So, recognizing that an airline might be quite different than an investment bank, which might be very different from a consumer products company. So when you take those 2 things together, then we can see SASB's materiality map. And this is a way where these 2 dimensions, you got 77 industries crossed with 26 different broad categories of ESG issues. And so when we look at SASB's materiality map, that's something where you can see kind of like a heat index. So we can see this on the next slide. We've got, this is a high level snippet of the materiality map. You can go to SASB's website and look at it in more detail. If we tried to put 77 by 26 cells up there, that's over 2,000 cells. So it would be a little hard to see. It's already a little hard to see. But the important thing to see here is that we're really focusing on like where there are the darkest shades. Like those are where a particular issue manifests as particularly prominent in a particular industry, or because of the business activities that relate to what that business might do. So in that respect, we're looking across and seeing that like no one issue really pops up as being prominent in every single industry, and there is no industry where everything is the most important or where nothing is the most important issues. And so what we're really looking at is trying to tailor the standard setting process to focus on what is most likely to be of relevance to the investor community, capital markets, and without overburdening companies by asking them to disclose on everything. So that's part of how we manage the cost-effective aspect of this. So that's in theory, that is like the idea, but then there's the process of how we actually go through it. And so the process relates to the work that we do to come up with our decisions around what those disclosure topics would be, what performance metrics we would be looking for, and the guidance that we would be giving. And the way that works is the basic process is think about what the issues are, think about what the industries do. And so we do industry research. We engage with the marketplace, talk to companies, talk to investors, and then come up with preliminary decisions, vet that through our standard setting process, and continue to iterate there. When we feel like we've got something that's ready for public, like a specific proposal, we put out an exposure draft and go through typically a 90-day public comment period before taking back the comments, redeliberating, and then making any final decisions. And then there's an ongoing process there. So historically, we've actually gone through 3 stages of standards development. And so really the first stage was to come up with the standards, because this was something where nobody had previously attempted to develop standards for capital markets related to E, S, and G types of issues. So the initial work was to develop industry working groups that would help the team to develop the provisional standards. And so the first phase from 2012 to about 2016 was the process where we, one sector at a time, developed the provisional industry standards. And then once we did that, we put those all out for public comment, and we're engaging with companies for a couple of year process before moving into the second stage of standards development, where the standards board was established to propose revisions to the standards. And then from there, release them from that sort of provisional status, and we call that our codification process. But again, it went through what you would expect: agenda setting, proposed changes, public discussions of that in board meetings, and then public comment, feedback, and then a board vote to approve the standards released from provisional status, including the revisions that were part of that process. And so that's what we did in the first 2 stages. We've now really moved into, for the last couple of years, so it was 2018, November of 2018, that we finished that second stage of standards development. And then we had 77 industry standards, as well as some application guidance that would apply broadly to all companies. So now we're in this third stage of standards development. And this is what I think of as kind of like the steady state of trying to, on an ongoing basis, do our standards maintenance of our standards. So on the next slide, you can see that the process, it looks a little bit different in a graphical representation, but really is the same. Think of it as being there's much more of a targeted focus on where we see opportunities to improve the standards. And we have a full complement of projects that we're working on right now. They come from a number of different types of issues that arise. Sometimes there's a shift in regulation. Sometimes we hear that there's an industry working group, a process that's going on out there to engage with companies, and there's an opportunity to align with that effort. Sometimes it's feedback from the companies themselves saying, now that we're trying to utilize the standards, we're recognizing that there's some opportunities to improve the clarity of the guidance that's given in the standards. So we work on all of that, but that's an ongoing process. And so when you think about what are the SASB standards, what is US GAAP? Well, that's everything inside of the codification that the FASB has. What are the SASB standards? You can think of them on the next slide. You can see think of it as just a compendium of 77 industry specific standards, as well as some application guidance that would apply broadly to all companies. So if you're a company out there and you're thinking about how would I use SASB standards, it's pretty straightforward in that you would download the application guidance and then look for the industry or the industries where there's the greatest alignment with your business operations. And inside of that, what you would see is that there are going to be, for your industry, some identified topics, typically 5 to 7 disclosure topics. Might be related to the environment, might be related to social capital, might be related to human capital. And then, if we could just stay on that previous slide for just a second longer, there would be some additional guidance around what are the performance metrics that would support performance reporting on that. So if for your industry, say greenhouse gas emissions was identified as a potentially as a disclosure topic, then we would have specific guidance that would talk about what the way would be to report that. So for example, scope 1 emissions. So climate risk is a great example of why an industry-specific approach is really helpful. Sometimes when people think about climate risk, they think in very broad cuts, like emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Of course they do, because that's one of the greatest contributors to climate change, especially from a human perspective. So, the issue though is that the ways in which climate risks are going to manifest themselves are likely to be quite different depending on the type of industry that we're talking about. And so some of the work that we've done, and you can read about this in SASB's climate risk technical bulletin, which we recently just revised. And it's freely available on the website. So in there we looked through using the CDP data around emissions and saw that 85% of scope 1, so these are the direct greenhouse gas emissions, 85% of those scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions are produced essentially by like 7 industries. And when you look at the figure on the right there, like there are no surprising candidates there, right? Like you see that essentially we're talking about like the power producers that are out there. We're talking about oil and gas companies and construction companies and the airline industries, the chemicals industries, metals and mining. Like these are the industries that are largely responsible for the direct emissions that occur with scope 1. And so the issue there then is that if we focus only on scope 1 emissions, we could see 100% reduction in the scope 1 emissions for 90% of the companies that are out there, and maybe have like almost zero actual change. And so like that's why this is so important to focus on, like what are the issues that are like most relevant in a given industry, most material, like the biggest ones. So if you then think about like, well then, so how would it change? If it's not scope 1 emissions, what might it be? So a great example there is to think about like the automobiles industry. So if we were to look at the automobiles industry on the next slide, we can see that here we're kind of translating the issues into those that are directly closely related to the types of issues that would be thought about in the boardroom. So in our climate risk technical bulletin, we talk about the fact that there are 3 kind of broad categories that we can think of. We think about physical risks, we think about transitions to a low carbon economy, and then we think about regulatory risks. And so all 3 of those things are something that could have a financial impact on a company's operation. The likelihood of that, though, of course, depends on the type of business that we're talking about. And some are more subject to potential regulation or would be more impacted by potential regulation. Some are more impacted by potential shifts in consumer preferences. So when you think about the automobiles industry, this is not one of the industries that are the primary contributors to greenhouse gas emissions directly through their operations. But of course, we know that when we are relying on fossil fuels to power the vehicles that these automobiles companies are selling, then in the life cycle assessment, that is a big potential impact. Now, there are ways in which you can capture that. You can think about life cycle assessments. You can think about scope 3 types of emissions. The way that we focused on this in our standard setting process is to try to, we refer to this as being, like what's most actionable. And so we actually think about trying to link the activities that the companies are engaged in to the impacts and the risks that are out there, the opportunities that are out there, and what's going to be discussed in the boardroom. So what we focus on for the automobiles industry with respect to climate is thinking about, for example, fleet fuel economy. Like what is the mix of vehicles that you are selling? What are your plans around the types of vehicles that you're selling? And from a climate profile, that is an opportunity for investors, capital markets, to say, okay, I can see how these different automobiles companies are taking similar or different approaches to the risks and opportunities related to climate change and their products. So that's just one of the types of examples that we could look to. But the more general issue is to think about, like, these are communications that are designed for investors. And so here we're really trying to think about, like on the next slide, what information is produced by financial accounting standards, and then how do we complement that by additional disclosures that relate to the types of information that investors really need to know about in order to make the types of decisions that investors and creditors make, whether that is an investment decision to buy a stock, to sell a stock, whether it is to vote their shares when it comes to a shareholder resolution or supporting management's appointed directors. So that's really what the goal is the full complement, to contribute to the full complement of information that is needed to communicate to investors in capital markets today. So that's kind of like an overview. That's the intro to SASB standards. And now what I want to talk a little bit about is like what are some of the trends that we're seeing? So what can you expect going forward? So first, let me just talk very directly about what the progress has been in terms of like SASB's use of SASB standards globally. So what we see here is so I've been working with SASB since 2012 to develop the standards. We didn't finish developing the standards until 2018, of course, in late 2018, and now we're engaged in ongoing maintenance of that. But really, there's been a tremendous growth in the market's acknowledgement that SASB standards can be useful to communicate to the investor community. And in particular, you can see that we're not even all the way through 2021 yet, but we're already seeing that we just topped 50% of the S&P Global 1200. So more than half of the very largest companies around the world have started to use SASB standards in their disclosures. And what we mean in this respect is that companies have both produced information consistent with the SASB standards and also have said that that's what they're doing. We don't actually require that companies check with us or ask for our permission to use the standards. They are freely available for companies to use, and they don't have to make us aware of that, although many do. And so we look for any instance where companies might be using it to track for our own statistics, but we don't require it. And so, I think our standards actually are even more impactful in some ways because they do get used to guide companies' disclosures, even when companies don't say that they are. If we could, we'll probably stay on this previous slide for just a second longer. And one of the things that Khrystyna is going to talk about is even before we finish the standards development process, how did the developments that we were engaging in, before companies were really using the standards explicitly, how did the standards development process, is there evidence that it had an impact on companies and what they were disclosing and how they were communicating with investors? So sticking again with this just for a little bit, I want to just point to, I think, the reason for the very sharp increase in growth. We've been hearing from the capital markets for a long time that we need better disclosures with respect to sustainability issues. That has been a bit of a drumbeat that we have heard, but it's turned into more of like a marching drum recently rather than a bunch of separately beating drums where there was confusion about what would be useful to investors. And I think what we've seen pretty recently is increasing clarity around that. And you could look to a couple instances. So one is that like Larry Fink's CEO letters for the last couple of years have specifically referenced use of SASB standards. And BlackRock has asked all of the companies in which it's invested to be producing SASB disclosures, as well as the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So the TCFD and SASB together. And then and State Street is another example where they have been very clear about how they need material, the most important ESG issues to be managed well within companies. And their assessment previously is that a lot of the disclosures did not relate to things that they thought were really relevant to investor decision-making, not really related to the most material issues that companies actually are facing. And so they developed what they call their R factor. This is a responsibility factor, but their R factor, and their CEO has talked about seeing it as being one of the things that would be, essentially like as important as your credit rating as a company going forward. And so what they do, and they talk about it in a guide that you could look at in SASB's Knowledge Hub at the Value Reporting Foundation. So what they basically explain is that they don't try to benchmark, they don't try to evaluate a company, hold a company to a high standard on every single issue. If you try to do that, then you're not really going to address the most important issues. And so they actually filter the data that they get from ratings and ranking companies about the sustainability profiles of companies. But they filter it, focusing in, they use SASB's materiality matrix to filter it to say, well, what are the issues that are most likely to matter in these industries from an investor perspective? And so those are the ones that they then focus most closely on. And I think those two things, BlackRock saying we need better disclosure and State Street saying, and here's how we're actually going to use it, have been really important aspects of seeing the increasing use of SASB standards. So very market-driven approach there. But I want to talk about more than just what's happening with SASB. So I think one of the biggest developments that's happening right now is with respect to the IFRS Foundation. So many of you may be familiar with the IFRS Foundation. They oversee the development of international financial reporting standards. These are the accounting standards that are widely used throughout the world by more than 140 companies in some respects in those capital markets around the world. And they are even used within the US. If you are a foreign filer, you can use IFRS standards in the US without reconciliation for the last 10 years or so now. And so they are widely used throughout the world, or permitted in some capacity. And they announced last fall, a year ago, that as part of their periodic strategy review, that they wanted that they were going to do a consultation on whether or not they should get involved in standard setting with respect to ESG issues. So they asked, is there a need for a global set of sustainability standards? Should the IFRS Foundation be involved in that? And if they are involved with that, what would the scope of that role be? Should they be a bit of like a contributor to the dialogue? Should they be pointing in a particular direction? Should they actually take it on directly? And so they put out a proposal last fall, a consultation. They got, I think it was like 577 or so comment letters, that is a lot of comment letters in the world of standard setting. And so what they heard back was a pretty strong yes, you should get involved. Yes, you should really only do that I would say, like, yes, you should get involved, but only do it if you think you can actually move this forward, this whole process forward, and not actually be a hurdle or a stumbling block. So what they are currently proposing, they have put out a proposal that is to essentially create a sister standards board that would sit underneath the Board of Trustees and next to the International Accounting Standards Board, which sets the IFRS accounting standards. And essentially there would be a second board. They have tentatively named it the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB. And it would be responsible for developing disclosure standards related to sustainability issues, but with the same mission that would be focused on there. So this would fit inside of their organization. And for those of you who are familiar with the IFRS Foundation's structure, they actually are overseen by what's called the Monitoring Board. And this is essentially like an organization that is a collection of the securities regulators and markets, right? The securities exchanges and capital markets regulators that are around the world. And so they oversee the appointment of trustees to the foundation and provide a public accountability aspect to the work that's being done. So what are they specifically thinking about with respect to the mission of this ISSB? So on the next slide, their response to those public comments shows that they are, one, focused on enterprise, on what investor needs around assessments of enterprise value. This is very consistent with what their approach is for international accounting standards. And that they would not be, like SASB, that they would not be narrowly focused, but broadly focused on sustainability issues. They've heard a lot of interest in climate. And so anything that they would put out first would be prioritizing climate, but recognizing a broad need to cover all of the ESG issues that are important. And you only need to look as recently as the last couple of years with the pandemic, with the Black Lives Matter movement, that to see that there are many social issues that can have huge impacts on companies' operations. So really, they recognize that they can't focus solely on climate. They want to build off of. They've said that they would be building off of existing frameworks, and so they have announced that they are working through what they call a technical readiness working group that is essentially comprised of the Value Reporting Foundation, so SASB standards, as well as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and a couple other organizations to really, that are also focused on investor needs. And so really trying to utilize the existing frameworks and what they're potentially going to utilize, and then thinking about a building block approach, recognizing that every jurisdiction is going to have some of their own needs that need to be met that might not be completely satisfied by just focusing on what investors' needs are. And so really hoping that the work of the IFRS Foundation's ISSB would be compatible, interoperable with what we see developed from a regulatory standpoint. So let me just touch very quickly on a couple of the regulatory initiatives that you probably should be aware of. One's in the EU. So the European Union has been moving for years. They've been kind of like at the forefront of this effort. There's been a regulation in place since I think maybe even 2014, but it's called the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and has required in its most recent version that companies, some companies in the operating in the European Union would need to produce essentially like a sustainability type of report or reports. Although what has historically been the case is that there's a lot of flexibility that companies have had to comply with that regulation. And so they have suggested that, using the SASB standards, using the TCFD standards, using some national standard, using a company's own standards, all might be ways in which the company could comply with that pre-existing directive. So what they have now shifted toward is the new version of this is going to be called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And it is much broader. It is going to affect, instead of around 10,000 companies, they think closer to 50,000 companies. It's not just public companies, it includes private entities, not-for-profits as well. And it seems like it would likely have an impact on any company that has significant operations in the European Union. And they're also talking about developing their own specific standards for what companies would have to use to disclose on. And they are not focused just on the capital markets needs. They're thinking broadly about policy issues, the needs of civic society. And so this is sometimes been referred to as like a double materiality, but think of that as like an extended reach of what are the material issues, not focusing just on what would affect assessments of enterprise value, but what do we need to know just from a public policy perspective about, like the way that we want companies to operate. And so it would be more extensive in its disclosure requirements. So big potential change that, not potential, like it's going to be a big change there. That's already starting to happen. You can expect those standards to be developed in two waves over the next 2 years, actually. And then when we think about what's happening inside of the US, the SEC has been really picking up the pace of its activities, and there's a lot of things. And I think if you're interested in this, I would point you these graphics are all pulled directly from the SEC's website. They now have a page. If you just Google, I think, SEC ESG, you're probably going to get this link to this particular page where they keep a listing of the different activities that they are engaged in. And so, just to highlight a couple of things that they have been focusing on. One is that one of the first things they did is they started to ask for comments on the existing guidance related to climate disclosure. So, many of you may know that the SEC in 2010, so over 10 years ago, had put out additional guidance. The SEC's framework is very principles-based, focuses on what is material to a company's operations, but doesn't specify exactly what a company would need to disclose or in what circumstances. Like, it doesn't specifically say you must say this. Oftentimes, it just says like, well, if it's material, if it's reasonably likely to affect your company, and you're aware of it, then talk about it. So it's a very principle-based approach. So in 2010, the SEC at that time, the commissioners at that time put out some guidance to say in response to, does this include climate issues? They said like, yes, it does, right? We're not saying every company has to talk about climate issues, but we are saying if management believes climate issues pose a material risk to their operations and they can assess that, they should be talking about that. So they're asking right now, they've been asking about whether or not that existing guidance is up to task and whether it should be updated. The Division of Examinations has been looking at essentially like what are the brokers and advisors out there who are essentially like selling ESG products. There's increasing demand for them. What are they doing? What are they saying? And is this actually, are they is there greenwashing going on essentially? And then that's from the products and brokers advisor side. Then from a corporate reporting side, they have put out a statement on the review of climate related disclosures. So the Division of Corporate Finance has been going through existing disclosures and looking at whether they think companies are complying with existing requirements with respect to disclosure around climate related issues. And in particular, you should, if you haven't seen this, they just put out a week or two ago a sample letter that would be a Dear Issuer type letter where they've really given examples of the types of things that they would be looking for. And so if you're an issuer and you haven't seen it yet, you should definitely take a look at that. But they're asking things like, can you explain the decision to talk about some issues in a sustainability report and not talk about those issues in your SEC filings, for example? That's just be one type of example. And then on the next slide, just really quickly, a couple of issues here. The Division of Enforcement is going to be taking, of course, action based on what the findings are with respect to what brokers and advisors and companies are doing. And then there are two other educational initiatives. I think those last two are really educational initiatives where they're trying to help the marketplace better understand what the issues are related to ESG that they should be aware of. So I hope that was helpful as an introduction to what SASB is doing and also to give you a sense of what the current trends are and what you can expect. I think in short, you can expect increased regulation, expanded disclosure, and improved information ultimately out there for the capital markets and for civic society more broadly. So with that, I'll stop and kick it over to my favorite co-author, Khrystyna Bachke, so she can talk about some of the research that we're doing related to this work.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff, for such a nice introduction. So in fact, I think Jeff is the paid participant to this conference, not me. I'm just, like a secretary helping him to paint a better picture of what sustainability reporting is and what are the challenges that we face and so on. So I apologize in advance for being a little bit repetitive in what repetitive meaning I will repeat a couple of things that Jeff has already emphasized, but repetition is just to highlight the challenges as well as opportunities when it comes to sustainability reporting. So over the past 100 years, what we have been doing as academics, practitioners, teachers in a classroom, we have been learning and trying to figure out how to measure profit. So the next slide summarizes how we typically rank companies. We rank them by how profitable they are. And our fixation on company profitability, it led to companies talking about profitability all the time and highlighting their success factors. So for example, companies highlight how their ability to deliver ever improving products, their ability to have next day delivery or same day delivery, their ability to combine computer, camera into one device called cell phone, their ability to create a new app that allows you to do whatever. So these are the success factors. But is this really a success if we have, on the next slide, if we have temperatures rising all over the world, and now we know for sure there is a research evidence that this is because of the human activities. Is this really a success that living in Florida every year we face and not just in Florida, in other places too, every year we face a very high probability of a very strong hurricane. Is it a success that we are drowning in plastic? Is it success that we are eating more and more processed food without really knowing what are the health consequences of this processed food and so on? So with that in mind, what started happening, and especially it's gaining a lot of interest in recent years, what started happening that investors or in general the broad stakeholders of firms, they want to see firms to report on externalities, not just on their success, but also on the externalities that they create for the society, for the world in general. So let me, before I start talking about our research paper with Jeff, I just want to highlight a couple of things of why it's, even though it's important to report on externalities, it's not as easy to do as one might think. So I want to open with a big question: how to account and report on environmental and social impacts? It sounds like a relatively easy question that, yeah, just report on what you do, right? And it will give you the big answer to this big question, but it's not as easy. So next slide summarizes the pain points for companies to report on sustainability. So first, if you look at the different frameworks, there are many frameworks and standards and guidelines that the company can follow to report on sustainability. The rumor has it that there are over 400 different frameworks around the world that one can follow to report on sustainability. And as a result, there is a great confusion about which framework to follow when communicating sustainability relevant information to stakeholders. There is also a lot of frustration about different ratings and rankings when it comes to sustainability. So if you have, let's say, the same company, let's say it's Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, or American Airlines, different sustainability ranking companies give you different numbers of how well these companies are performing. And this correlation between rankings, even though these rankings are based on the same public information, these rankings can have correlation as low as 10-30%, which tells you what are we really measuring, and what we are really measuring in these. What these rankings are really capturing is a black box. We don't know, and it all comes from the difficulty to gather which information is relevant and which information is not, to differentiate between relevant and irrelevant information. And many companies didn't even report on sustainability because, again, they were facing this challenge of what to report. Also, a lot of numbers that companies do report, they are through surveys. So it's a survey-based evidence. And obviously, too much time is spent on surveys. By the time you validate the answers, the survey outcomes, it's already too late, meaning that this information is already obsolete and no longer useful, right? We already 2 years ahead since we conducted the survey, for example. It's also difficult. I already mentioned that it's also difficult to measure sustainability performance because companies were not really focusing on sustainability. And if you can stay just a little bit longer on the previous slide, companies were not really focusing on sustainability in their day-to-day communications with investors. For example, earnings conference calls. There was such a great fixation on earnings, revenues, that's mainly was the topic of discussion in main firm events like conference calls. And it was also difficult to get buy-in from company boards and management. But as Jeff emphasized, it started changing in recent years after Larry Fink emphasized how important it is to report on sustainability and so on. So right now, the last point that I just highlighted is, I think it's no longer that relevant. So just to summarize what I just said, next slide tells us, it's just a visual, that there is a lot of noise in communication in trying to figure out sustainability, so in the communication between companies and investors. And sustainability standards like SASB's, they can help to cut through this noise. Just to summarize and emphasize one more time why SASB standards can help to cut through the noise in communication is because these standards are focusing on information, on sustainability information that is material to investors, that investors find decision useful. These standards are industry specific. And again, industry specificity is a big deal, as Jeff mentioned, because again, you would expect that airline companies should talk about greenhouse gas emission, but this is not such a relevant issue for an e-commerce company, for example. However, data privacy is a relevant issue for e-commerce company, but it's not as relevant for an airline company, for example. So the industry specificity of standards is super important. By the way, the manner in which SASB developed the standards, it's evidence-based. So it was based on the feedback from corporate managers, from industry experts, from investors, and so on. So it's evidence-based, research-based, and market-informed. That's why this is, I keep highlighting that this is one of the frameworks that kind of aligns everyone's supply and demand in terms of sustainability reporting. So just to, Jeff didn't have that picture, that timeline. I just want to again summarize how, what were the building blocks of sustainability standards when they started, and what was the timeline of the standard development process. SASB was founded in 2011, right? And the idea for SASB standards was actually outlined in a research paper, right, by researchers at Harvard University. And then one of the authors of the paper went on, her name is Jean Rogers, she went on and created Sustainability Accounting Standards Board with the idea of creating industry-specific sustainability standards, not guidelines, but standards that give you guidelines, right? But also give you a set of measures that you can use to report on relevant to the industry sustainability issues. So during the period 2012 through 2016, SASB was working on developing standards for 77 different industries across 11 different sectors, with the help of their own analysts, with the input from the market, such as managers, investors, analysts, industry experts, and so on. And then the final set of approved codified SASB standards was released in November 2018. So from what I just said, right, you would argue that, yeah, there is no doubt that companies will start following SASB standards, will listen to this sustainability sustainability framework and so on, right? But this is just an anecdote. We need to see a real evidence whether companies responded to these standards or not. So what we do with Jeff and our other co-author, George Serafine, we have a research paper that looks at the disclosure standards and the title of the paper is Disclosure Standards and Communication Norms, Evidence from Voluntary Disclosure Standards as a Coordinating Device for Capital Markets. Very sophisticated title, right? But behind this title hides a very simple research question. Do SASB standards change the topic of conversation in earnings conference calls? Meaning that, do we see that companies start talking about sustainability issues more, so they fixate on, let's say, earnings less, following the release of provisional standards? So we are going back to the time when SASB was just working on the developing standards, industry-specific standards, and we want to see whether we observe change in what companies communicate to investors in their earnings conference calls. You may ask that out of all disclosure outlets, why do you focus on earnings calls? Earnings conference calls is one of the major forms of corporate communications with investors, right? So probably out of all major firm events, this is the event that attracts most of the attention from the public, right? And this is a spoken event, so this is not like reading the SEC filings that are very filtered and polarized by lawyers. So this is just us talking here today. It allows us really to capture the topic of conversation, and it's not hidden by boilerplate legalized legal language. What also is important in earnings calls that it includes the call event. It includes interactions between analysts and management, and some investors can participate as well. So we can capture with earnings calls whether management focuses on the sustainability issues, how much interest there is from analysts, and so on. And companies themselves or institutional investors and so on, they often highlight when they talk about sustainability, where they want to see that information being discussed, they often highlight that earnings calls is probably one of the best venues to discuss focus on sustainability. So we are not, Jeff and I, we don't have time to read or listen to all earnings conference calls out there and try to figure out whether they talk about relevant issues, sustainability issues or not. So what do we do to analyze earnings calls disclosures? We engage in a large scale textual analysis. Okay, so we work with over 50,000 of transcripts of earnings calls by transcripts of all major companies in the United States. And we create a dictionary of ESG terms. So we create a dictionary of buzz, if you may think about it as like buzz sustainability terms. How do we create this dictionary? We work with SASB sustainability standards. These standards, as Jeff emphasized, they highlight the metrics that companies should report. They also highlight a lot of discussion of what these metrics are, what's relevant for an industry, and so on. So to create the dictionary of buzz ESG terms, we analyze disclosure topic descriptions in SASB 77 industry standards. There are around 5 to 7 disclosure topics for a given industry. We go through disclosure topic descriptions. We ask our own students to go through these disclosure topic descriptions and give a set of keywords that characterize each disclosure topic. So in this manner, we were able to code 444 disclosure topics. So again, this is just think about it as a way of capturing ESG buzzwords. So next slide gives you an example of what disclosure topic description looks like. And this is a data privacy issue for an internet media and services company. And we capture buzzwords with keywords like hacking, privacy concerns, customer data, and so on. So in our large scale analysis of earnings calls, what we will be doing, we will try to capture how many times a given company talks about these buzzwords in their earnings calls. And since we are interested in studying the impact of SASB standards on disclosure, we will be looking at this discussion pre and post SASB standards. So again, how we capture the content of earnings calls, next slide tells us we literally count the proportion of sentences that talk about sustainability issues, those issues that were identified by SASB as relevant, as material to a specific industry. We calculate this measure for the entire earnings call, and we also break it into portions, for example, whether only management talks about ESG in the introductory remarks, or maybe whether analysts are asking, and as a result, management is responding to those questions. So we want to see whether there is some change in the discussion coming from the supply side management, or it's also coming from the demand side analysts. I will not overwhelm you with the with the research details of the study. They are definitely complex, and we did a lot of work trying to make sure that our results are attributable to SASB standards development process and not something else. But what we observe in the study, we observe a significant increase in the amount of ESG discussion in earnings calls following SASB's provisional standards. So in this graph that you see in front of you, point 0, this is when SASB released its provisional standards. Point -1 is when SASB started. Around that time in years, this is when SASB started developing industry standards. And you can see that the change in discussion in earnings call started happening around the time when SASB started working on the standards, right? And it kept increasing and remained relatively stable afterwards, meaning that the effect of SASB standards is long-lasting. So we find that there is a response in terms of what firms talk about in earnings calls after the SASB standards were released on the provisional basis. We also look at obviously we do not expect this is an effect that we show in the graph. This is an average effect. But obviously there are some firms that responded more than the others. And our expectation that what would be a typical average firm that will respond the most to the standards, our prediction that firms that didn't talk about sustainability before, they would be the first best candidates to respond to SASB standards. And perhaps they didn't talk about sustainability because they just didn't know what to report, right? It's difficult to figure out which disclosure topics are relevant or not. Here, SASB comes in with their set of material issues to discuss, and those industries that didn't talk about, those companies that didn't talk about sustainability issues before, they may talk about them following these guidelines. And indeed, this is what we find in the paper, that the increase in earnings call discussion is particularly strong among firms that didn't talk about sustainability in the pre-SASB standards period. They just didn't mention their labor practices. They didn't talk about wastewater, recycling, and so on. We also find that the increase in firm response to the standards is also very strong among industries where there is a lot of disagreement about sustainability reporting. So how we measure disagreement, we got this data directly from SASB, where they were surveying corporate managers, investors, and asking them, is this issue, do you think that this issue, the sustainability issue, is relevant to this industry or not? So we have measures of how much disagreement there is between management, analysts, and so on with regard to which issues are relevant or not. And we find that there is this very strong increase in firm response to SASB standards among firms where there was a lot of disagreement, with the conclusion that SASB standards do help to cut through the noise in communication that happens between management and investors. So takeaways of our study, voluntary emphasis on voluntary, right? No one mandated SASB standards yet. And especially when you go back to periods 2012 and onwards, right? SASB standards were out there, but definitely they were not emphasized by Larry Fink or other big fish in the pond, right? So these voluntary SASB standards, the takeaway of our study, had a significant impact of what is being discussed in earnings calls on firm disclosures. We conclude that SASB standards shifted management, analysts, and investor focus towards more long-term sustainability matters. And indeed, what is being discussed, we hope that this is what is being managed. So if companies talked about their recycling, greenhouse gas emission, and so on in earnings calls, that led to their actual reporting of meaningful numbers later on. And that's why we see the spike, what Jeff showed us, of firms actually reporting numerical information with regard to these material industry issues, sustainability issues. I want to conclude my presentation with just my hope and everyone else's hope who is working in this field, that the decade environmental and social impact will become as transparent as financial performance, right? And this comes not just from we just hope that every company will respond to this call, to this strong demand to be very transparent with respect to how they treat their employees, what is the work safety, what is the externality of the product that they are producing, and so on. Thank you so much for your attention today. Apologies for being a little bit maybe too technical when discussing the research study, but yeah, that's the study is in public domain if you want to know more details about what we did and how we did it. Thank you. So,
if you have a question you would like to ask, please put it in the side chat at this time.
So one thing I would just echo there, Khrystyna, I actually think that the last point you made is a really important one, and in some ways I think that like the whole issue here is that like we need increased transparency, but we don't want transparency just as a compliance exercise. We don't want transparency just to put an increased burden on companies to disclose, increased pile of information for companies, for investors to wade through. We actually want this all to be part of improved company operations, that companies are operated in a way that is more sustainable over the long run, so that there's greater value creation in the economy for across generations as well. And that's the real goal. And I think it's really important to think about the way in which information feeds into that. And there's another great example of a recent paper that it looks at the mine safety disclosures. So many people will know that part of Dodd-Frank was included in the Dodd-Frank Act was a requirement that companies would include the mine health and safety disclosures that were part of actually already disclosures that were required by the Mine Safety and Health Administration. And so one of the interesting things there is that the disclosure was asking about the safety of and incidents related to the operations of mines. And that information was already being regulated by a regulator. It was already being disclosed on that administrator's website. And so companies were measuring it, and they were reporting it to a regulator. But then as part of financial regulation, that information got required to be put in corporate filings in the US. And so one of the interesting things in this recent research, this is not our research, but it's but people that we know, smart people, what's interesting is that they actually showed that the improvements in the health and safety of these operations actually didn't really occur until the information was being disclosed in corporate filings. And that's a really great example of how it's not just about measuring, it's not just about ticking a compliance box, that there really needs to be some sort of accountability that takes place there. And the paper goes on to suggest that what the accountability mechanism that improved essentially the health and safety of employees in mining companies was attributable to the negative capital market reactions that would then happen as a result of disclosures around incidents. And so that's just a great example of how there needs to be a kind of a facilitating of accountability around the issues that are most important given a company's operations.
Right, great example of what I just said. What's being disclosed is being measured, is being scrutinized, right?
So I do have a question for Jeff. Given all of the changes happening from a regulatory standpoint, does it make sense to wait to see how this all shakes out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a fairly common sentiment that is sometimes expressed. It can be very difficult, and in the face of uncertainty around what's going to be required, it's very natural, I think, for companies to say, look, let's just wait until we're told what to do, and then we can do it. And it's kind of a very understandable response. But the thing that I would say is that from a corporate perspective, you really should never let reporting requirements be the driver of what it is you measure and manage within your business. So that needs to be driven by what's most important for enterprise value. Companies already sort of know what those issues are. So you should do a good job of making sure that you're actually already capturing the information that you need to run your businesses well. When you think it's appropriate to be disclosing that information, you should be, in order to tell your company's story. And I think that's the number one driver of corporate communications, is like, what is it that you think is important for you to be understood by the capital markets? A related question is like, what are your investors asking for now, right? And so even before there are regulatory requirements saying you must do this or you may do this, I think if your investors are already saying, this is what we want to hear, then I think, that's another thing to already be directly engaging with them and providing that information. Take control of that dialogue in a sense, because if you don't provide the information that investors are asking for, it's not that they're just going to act like that information doesn't matter. That's not how disclosure theory works. I think and I've heard this time and time again from investors saying, like, if we need certain information and the company doesn't want to disclose it, then we'll make an estimate of what we think that information is. And they'll use whatever sources they can reasonably turn to for that. They'll come up with like their best estimation of it, but that may not be as favorable as what the reality is. And so it's important that companies actually take control of that dialogue. If there's information your investors need, you should really seriously consider about engaging with the investor community to make sure that you're getting that information out there for them. And then I think at the end of the day, sure, there is a question around, well, what are you required to do? But that should really be the last step in the disclosure sequence. First, what is it that we need to communicate? What is it that we're directly hearing questions about? And then, what is it that if it hasn't already been something that we've been talking about, let's make sure that we've checked all of the boxes at the end of the day from a compliance perspective. But it should not be a regulatory compliance perspective that is driving disclosure. It shouldn't be what's driving measurement and management within your business. So in that sense, I would say don't wait. And then I would guess there's actually one other aspect to all of this, which is that also there is some uncertainty to be resolved, but there's a lot of clarity around direction. So you can kind of predict where this is all going. I mean, what can we kind of expect in the US? I don't think that the SEC is going to, suddenly, in the next month say, you know what? The FASB also should have a sister sustainability board that would directly, or the FASB should directly set sustainability reporting requirements. I think that just seems pretty unlikely. I mean, I don't know what they'll do, but I do think that the SEC has already clearly signaled that they want to make sure that investors are getting the information that they need, and they're going to ask questions. So you can expect there to be some scrutiny of whether or not companies that you would expect to have material risks related to climate change are actually, for example, talking about those issues right now. I think you can expect the SEC to ask for some broad requirements of most companies. It might be around scope 1 emissions. It might be around human capital. They already did it with respect to human capital last year. The previous administration already kind of expanded in some ways, like the call for improved disclosures around material human capital issues that companies face, including as a requirement now saying definitely tell us how many employees you have, but then also what are the key issues that you manage, and if it's material to disclose that. I wouldn't be surprised then if we saw additional guidance from the SEC in terms of what are those human capital issues some additional human capital issues that might be of interest broadly across the marketplace. So you might see some increased clarity there. But the thing that you've definitely heard very clearly is that the largest institutional investors have spoken clearly around the task force on climate-related financial disclosures and SASB standards, and those two things work very well together. That has been a clear drumbeat for the last couple of years, and so any additional specific requirements, I think, are likely to be building off of that momentum, that direction. And so if anything, you'll just be ahead of the curve rather than moving in the wrong direction. So I would say invest in the process now. It's not that easy to start this process in some ways.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. And the question is, should a company only focus on investor needs?
That's a good question. When communicating to investors, yes. But I think I think it's really important for companies to manage communications with and relationships with all of their key stakeholders, right? So we know that some companies are very customer oriented. We know that some companies are very employee oriented. We know that some have to maintain very good relationships with the governments in which they do business because of the license to operate that they have to maintain. We know that some have really big impacts on the local communities where they operate, and so they have to manage those social capital issues very well. Like all of those, like a good company has to manage all of its key stakeholder relationships. Managing those relationships means that you need to think about what the issues are, what do they care about. You need to probably communicate some of those things, and you need to communicate it to those key parts. I think, like going back to the mining example, safety of employees is really key for a mining company, and the first place companies should think about disclosing that is to the employees and making sure that the employees know that information. But some of that, especially for a mining company, might bubble up to the level of like what capital markets also need to know about. And so really you can't only focus on communicating to the capital markets, but you should look at like all your key communications and think about which of those is going to bubble up to the level of being most important for capital markets communications. And I would argue that SASB is a great place to start with looking for like what some of those issues would be for your company. But at the end of the day, companies have to meet the reporting needs and manage all of their stakeholder relationships.
Yeah, I agree with Jeff. And also, even if they communicate to employees, it will have eventually a direct impact on company's performance. It will. There is no way around it, right? If you keep your employees happy or safe or whatever, right, they will work harder. They will just deliver in a better way and improve your performance long term.
Can you overinvest? Can you underinvest in your employees? Yes. Can you overinvest in your employees? Probably also yes, right? And so this is really the issue, is like without actually trying to capture the extent to which and the manner in which companies are doing that, it's really easy, I think, for companies to get caught up in the short-term earnings cycle and maybe to underinvest. But like what we're really looking for here is improved disclosure so that companies better manage the issues over the longer term. Thank you. It's been great to be here today.
Thank you.